It's so good to see you, and I so appreciate you coming to speak with us on this day. You and I and all of us, we're each being called to explore new ways to be and lead in our lives during these extraordinary times of tremendous challenges and opportunities. We're each unique gifts who chose to be here now, and we're not islands. In fact, we are never alone. We are responsible for the use and abuse of our God-given power to be alive. This special, divinely guided interview with you, Ed Dowd, will explore the current crises with a unique perspective and how to consciously manifest positive transformation from our personal lives to impact the global and more universal co-creation. Hello. For some of you who don't know me, my name is Joyce Anastasia, and I'm the founder of the company Lead by Wisdom and the author of Extraordinary Leadership During Extraordinary Times. Our mission and the focus of my work is to evoke the greatest gifts, benevolent and discerning choices, and ethical ways of being, leading, and co-creating in the world, from individual to companies to nations. I believe we can and do change. We can affect transformation in the world and contribute to shifting the crises, helping to make this a better place to be. It is my deepest pleasure and honor to introduce Ed Dowd, a man of deep integrity, conviction, humanity, and faith. He is a man who understands the integration of systems both within our bodies and souls, but within our world as well. His perspective highlights the economic and financial aspects of systems and the crises we face. In this interview, we'll address the current crises, current smoking guns with the research that Ed has done, and the ultimate battle of good versus evil, and the aspects of that address divinely loving ways to lead and be, and our responsibility to make choices to that end. Ed, this is a crisis of enormous proportions, like a high-speed train that is drone-controlled without brakes, and the bulk of humanity is forced to stand on its tracks. Can you please share a summary of your background, your research, and how you got here, how we got here?
Sure. My name again is Ed Dowd, and I am a former professional on Wall Street. I spent many years of my career studying capital markets, studying stocks, currencies, bonds. I began after college. I went to a firm called HSBC, which is a global British bank that was involved all over the globe. And in my job there, my job was to sell fixed income products. I was based out of Chicago when I was a young man, and I learned how the monetary system works, how the debt systems work, how currencies work, and how they're all interrelated. I wanted to become a stock picker, so I went back to business school to get into the equity business. And I learned a lot about finance as it's taught academically, but it's not how it's actually carried out in the real world. I also learned, we had a great ethics professor. His name was Mike Metzger. And one of the quotes that still haunts me today and is part of the current crisis is this quote: "You can't rationalize facts to someone whose position is based on emotion." Then after business school, I graduated and I went to Wall Street, worked at Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette. And there I was an equity analyst in electric utilities. And I was there from 1997 through 99. And that's where I saw the dot-com crisis begin to unfold. And I saw how the sausage was made on Wall Street. And the scandal then was investment banks were dispensing with their usual due diligence because business was so good. And they were just doing deals to make money. And the research department was promoting those deals. Now, I was in electric utilities. I saw it happen. I wasn't part of the fraud because the electric utilities were not exciting in 1999. So I saw how the sausage was made, and I saw what went on. It wasn't called fraud then, but you could sense that something was off. It was the institutional imperative. I saw it at DLJ and other investment banks. It was going on throughout all of Wall Street. Then I wanted to go manage money. So I went to become a technology analyst up in Boston at Independence Investments. And there, I was a very young analyst covering a different sector than I had on Wall Street. But because of my, I guess, early discernment about how the world works in history, I determined that this was a bubble and that bubbles are usually created by loose monetary policy. So I was able to steer my firm out of the way of a lot of the wreckage in the dot-com bubble. They didn't listen to me 100%, but enough so that we did well. And what I determined there was a lot of the firms that had been created were created with junk bond money, easy money. They had no revenues, but there were lots of projections for in the future. And a lot of the dot-com spending was due to these newly created companies called CLECs. And for some reason, because of my background in fixed income and equities and learning equities, I realized that debt markets drive equities for the most part. And it was not hard for me to figure out that the dot-com bubble was going to go bust because the Fed was then raising interest rates at the time in 99 into 2000. And that choked off the credit. The companies that were buying all these technologies from all these other companies started to go bankrupt, and then the whole thing fell apart. And then the great frauds like Enron and WorldCom were exposed. So that's where I figured out there was a cycle to these things, and that the monetary system creates boom and bust. Initially in the boom, they lower interest rates, pump money into the banking system that then gets lent, and they keep the punch bowl usually around too long, and then the monies that are lent eventually turn into fraud somewhere. You don't know where the fraud ends up, but it usually presents itself somewhere in the system. So that was corporate fraud in the late 90s. And then the Fed, then after a 50% correction in the stock market in 9/11, the Fed lowered interest rates considerably, and the cycle began anew. Money printing began, lending began, and this time the bubble snaked its way into real estate. And there was a real estate boom, as many of you remember, in the early 2000s. Yeah. And the mantra then, in the dot-com crisis, the catchphrase was, it's a new paradigm. So the catchphrase in the real estate crisis that was brewing was, home prices never go down. So we built a whole system over the next 6 years around fraudulent mortgage-backed bonds that Wall Street created and sold to insurance companies and investors. And the fraud was perpetuated through easy money and then eventually a corruption of the rating agencies. These are third-party independent verifiers of the soundness of the bonds, which were then sold to institutions that wanted safety but yield. So they bought these AAA bonds thinking that they were going to be fine. Fast forward, the AAA bonds were not fine, and they ended up going down 60, 70%. And that's because home prices did go down, even though that mantra was home prices never go down. That was the belief system in that fraud. And because the fraud had moved from corporations onto banks, investment banks produced these bonds. They sold them to banks. They sold them to insurance companies. It was a systemic problem. And we had the great financial crisis when the Fed started to raise interest rates again. Credit became tight, and then the fraud was exposed, and then it all started to unwind. And what happened to the fraud that was perpetrated from 2001 through 2007? That fraud was then bought by the central banks onto their balance sheets. Where is that fraud today? It's still there. That fraud never disappeared. I call it the uniparty political system. The Democrats and the GOP, the Republicans, they work for the same folks. Those folks are corporations and moneyed interests. They create laws and pretend that there's controversy, but there really isn't. They're both about getting political donations, getting bribes, getting monies and things of interest for their families and themselves.
And so a total conflict of interest, puppets on strings sort of scenario.
Correct. And it's been going on forever. And so then roll forward. So for the last 12 years, the central bankers have really been running the show, and politicians have been spending like drunken sailors to keep the economy kind of muddling along. And the last 12 years has been a tale of two cities. Those who are close to the printing machine, meaning the central banks, benefited. So if you were a large hedge fund owner, your assets were pumped up. You were able to make a lot of money because you charge a percent of fees. And if the markets go up, you get 20% of the profits. They weren't in on this. They just benefited from it. If you were in the C-suite of a corporation, the money printing enabled your stock prices to forever rise. And so you issued yourself stock options. So the rich became richer, and the rest just kind of muddled along. So the last 12 years have been kind of a zombie economy. But the problem was, over the last 12 years, this fraud never really got dealt with in the great financial crisis. So they papered over it. And as you know, in great money printings, the printing of this money created fraud in government and fraud at the central banks. And so the debt bubble has gotten so big that myself and a bunch of other people in the financial industry started to think about how would this manifest? How would this global debt collapse manifest? Because it has to manifest, because the global monetary system is based on our fiat currency is a debt-based monetary system. So what that means is you print money, but that money has to be lent. So it's constant credit creation. Yeah. And it needs constant flow and constant growth. Any disruption to that growth causes it to contract. So they knew eventually that the system would become unhinged somewhere in the globe. Some country would go bankrupt and set off a daisy chain of events. So we were all trying to figure out when the bubble would end and how it would end and how it would manifest. We all suspected that it would end with currencies, some countries' currencies becoming in crisis, and would lead to war.